Well, a very good morning, friends, and welcome to another Wisdom Wednesday with me, Rocky Stevenson, pastor of Benoi Bible Church. And today we'll be discussing an area that impacts nearly every single believer at some point, and that is the challenge and the growth opportunities that arise within marriage. Now, when we have relationships, there's always trial and difficulty, and of course your husband or your wife is your immediate neighbor. So if you want to know if you're doing well in the loving of your neighbor side of things, you could ask your husband or your wife, how am I doing with loving my neighbor? How does it look, me laying down my life? And we're going to be focusing in on Song of Solomon 5, verse 2 to 6, verse 10. I've prepped quite a bit, and so we'll see how far we get. And if we have to leave some out, we'll leave some out for next week. But we're going to reflect on how conflict can either divide a marriage or actually deepen it. And we'll explore also the biblical principles of selflessness, sacrifice, and the importance of dying to oneself. So I'm Rocky Stevenson, pastor of Benoi Bible Church, and welcome to Let's Talk with me here on Radio Pulpit. Whether you're married or preparing for marriage, or even looking to encourage others, then these lessons from God's Word are really such a guidance to living out the gospel-centered type of a marriage. Remember that marriage really points to Christ and His bride, the church. And so this is the area that we really do see Jesus being glorified, is with inside of the marriage being done in such a way that the gospel would be highlighted. So let's look at the conflict and the separation. In verse 2 to 3 of Song of Solomon 5, verse 2, it introduces us to a moment of relational tension in the book of Song of Solomon. The bride is resting, and her heart awakens, or her heart is awake, yet hesitant. And when her beloved comes to her, knocking at the door with words of tender affection, saying, "Open to me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my perfect one," such wonderful little words used, and you should use pet words for your wife next time that you're wondering, if you want to make your wife feel happy or not, you should just go to her and say, "Hello, my dove," and just to start making some dove noises or something, because that's biblical, that Song of Solomon. Yet in this moment, she's actually reluctant in that section. She hesitates to let him in. And perhaps she's tired, or she's, kind of comfortable. She doesn't want to become uncomfortable, or simply she actually just hesitates to respond to him right away. And her words in verse 3 show her sense of inconvenience. She's basically saying there, I've taken off my dress already, and how can I put it back on? I've already washed my feet. How can I dry them again or dirty them again? In other words, I'm in bed, and you're waking me here while I'm here. And so the scene actually captures such a relatable picture of human relationships, because when you think about this, there's little moments of selfishness that can bring about such difficulty within marriage. Every time that you inject selfishness into your marriage is another time that you are really bringing about tension in a marriage. And this is so relatable, because there's moments when one partner's expression of love or request for connection might actually be met with a closed heart or a closed mind because of somebody just being uncomfortable with that, or not comfortable with doing what the other spouse is asking for. And in marriages, we often see these subtle tensions that arise, like what we see even here. She's in bed, she's rested already, and now he's at the door and he's knocking and he's saying, "Can you please open to me?" And we each have moments where our own needs or comfort may take precedence over the desires to connect from our spouse. And this part of the Song of Solomon reminds us that even the strongest relationships can experience moments of separation, and sometimes that's caused by something as simple as a missed opportunity or a delayed response. And we need to be honest with these things and see the reality that we are such human beings. But then there's the pain of longing and the pursuit, and we see that next in verse 4 to 6, because as we continue in verse 4 to 6, the bride realizes her mistake. Her beloved's hand reaches through the latch of the door, just a tender gesture of his love, which stirs her heart. But by the time that she opens the door, he's gone, in verse 6. So this is a poetic look at such a tension. It says there in verse 6, "I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had turned away and had gone." So her hesitation had led to a moment of distance, and now she's filled with longing, driven by regret and love, and she goes out to search for him. She's calling for him, but actually just finding herself alone. And in marriage, moments like these can really echo the pain of emotional or even spiritual distance between a husband and a wife. And a small understanding can sometimes lead to feelings of isolation or disappointment. And so the longing for reconnection becomes all-consuming at times. And we must remember in these moments to look to Christ, to look to His Word, to look to repentance and confession. And these passages really illustrate the humility that is required to pursue reconciliation. And it might be that your marriage is in need of the pursuit of reconciliation, where some of these small things have happened in your marriage that have become now big things. I don't think that there's any bride that lands up before the pastor, or she's walked down the aisle in our type of a settings and comes and stands in front with the pastor about to talk to the congregation and give his sermon and allow the marriage vows to be passed. I don't think anybody comes to that moment and goes, I want to have the worst marriage possible. But really what happens is sometimes you allow neglect into the marriage. And these moments of neglect can sometimes really start to pile up and become an avalanche of despair. And the conflict arises, and then both parties may not be willing to actually set aside their pride and to reach out in pursuit of one another. And much like the bride here, whose regret moved her to search for her beloved, despite the obstacles, that's what we're meant to do. We're meant to go out of our way to seek to lay down our life for our beloved or our lover. Then we see the reconciliation and the joy that there is in selfless love, because we see in verse 1 to 10 of chapter 6 some of this. The beauty of this passage is that it doesn't end in that separation, because as we see in chapter 6 verse 1 to 10, we see the bride's search renewed by the loving response of her, or really rewarded by the loving response of her friends, and eventually her reunion with her beloved. In verse 3 she proclaims, I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. And this joyful statement reflects this renewed connection and this reaffirmation of their bond, this beautiful picture of how love can overcome the distance that is caused by misunderstandings or even by delays. And when there's a humility and there's a seeking out of one another and there's this willingness to lay down our life, this is where we see the beauty of marriage. We also see the healing power of a selflessness within the love of marriage. And true reconciliation often requires this humility and a willingness to forgive. Both husband and wife must die to themselves, putting their love for one another above their own comfort. What we need to see in husbands and wives is this focus on God and this worship of God, but also putting their marriage actually above their individuality. And part of the sadness of our day is this constant real push of individualism and this idea of I need to get what's mine and I must get it my way or it's the highway. Both the husband and the wife must die to themselves and they must live in the marriage. That's part of the point, is that they must no longer be two, but they must be one flesh. And this kind of a sacrificial love is what the Apostle Paul calls husbands and wives to in Ephesians 5 verse 25 to 28, where he exhorts them to love one another as Christ loved the church. How did Jesus love the church? Well, he loved the church selflessly, sacrificially, and with a deep desire to nurture and cherish the church. And so this ought to be the way that husbands and wives love one another, laying down of their life. So in marriage, there's challenges like these that are not only natural, but also can be really sanctifying to the marriage. Here, you just imagine the scene. She's just in bed, she's gotten her clothes off, she's gotten her feet clean, and now her husband comes to her and she's thinking, I'm a little bit comfortable. She's late on kind of responding to her husband. Next thing, he's gone already. What tension, but then there's humility and there's a seeking out of one another. Just as the bride's pursuit of her beloved deepened her love and her appreciation for him, so too can marital conflict actually serve to sanctify us. These moments call us to grow, they call us to forgive, they call us to depend more on God's love to sustain and to guide us. Which one of us can actually even survive with another human being apart from the grace of Jesus? So the beloved's willingness to wait and the bride's pursuit both reveal a selfless heart that echoes Christ-like love. These qualities, patience, humility, self-sacrifice, these are what shape us to become more like Christ in our relationships. Your marriage, dear one, Dear Christian, your marriage is actually a stage on which you get to do a dance of glory to the Lord. You're able to actually draw near to the Lord through your marriage. All of the challenges that you have, all of the difficulties that you go through in your marriage, all of it is meant to draw from your heart a Christ-likeness, a self-sacrifice, a willingness to lay down my own rights. In many respects, as my fellow elder Henny often says, he says, marriage is a crucifixion. You must die to yourself so that Christ might live. And when Christ lives in you, this is when your marriage becomes beautiful. So how can we apply these poetic and these timeless truths to our marriage today? Well, first we should remember that misunderstandings and conflict are actually a part of the human experience. And often it's our response to these moments that determine the depth of our love. It's never actually your wife's fault or your husband's fault when there's marital tensions in your life. It's part of showing you that you're a sinner in need of grace, in need of Jesus. And so we must strive to pursue our spouses rather than distance ourselves from one another. Be quick to forgive and seek out one another with a humble heart. Don't allow the sun to go down on your anger. Prioritize your husband or your wife's needs and their well-being above your own comfort. It's an opportunity for you to lay down your life. That's what marriage is. So just as the bride steps out to find her beloved, even at her own inconvenience, this must be the way that we live. Selflessness is crucial for marriage. It's grounded in what we see, what Jesus did even for us. But what about conflict or even the path of sanctification? James 1 verse 2 to 4 teaches us that we should consider it all joy when we encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Now, there can be sometimes, marital troubles can be some of the most difficult conflicts, but we should see this as a means of rather rejoicing to see what is Jesus going to do in this. And sometimes we might be in a situation where we need a miracle, where we need to be humbling ourselves before our God, and we need to stop it with our pride. We get so selfish and we get so self-centered. We need to be those that lay down our life for one another. And there's some practical steps for this, and one of them would be to communicate with grace and patience. In Proverbs 15 verse 1 we read, "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." When differences arise within your marriage, it's essential to communicate without attacking or becoming defensive. Instead, listen intently and speak with respect, and seek to understand your husband or your wife's perspective, and then commit to forgiveness. This ought to be something of the backbone for every marriage. In marriage, forgiveness must be ongoing and unconditional, reflecting Christ's forgiveness towards us. Colossians 3 verse 13 instructs us, saying, "Bear with one another and forgiving one another. Whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you forgive." True forgiveness releases resentment and bitterness and makes room for healing and restoration within relationships. And this is such a sad reality in our day. How often marriages have unforgiveness that becomes this bitterness and this pride, and it just becomes horrid, and you've forgotten how the Lord has forgiven you. This is the way that we must live. We must be committed to forgiveness within our marriages, and then pray together and for each other. And this is, I believe, one of the bedrocks for a healthy marriage. Those that pray together stay together. Those that do not pray together often separate. And finally, prayer is this powerful way to realign both the heart of the husband and the wife toward God's purposes. In times of conflict, praying together can soften hearts and remind both parties of their dependency upon God. When you pray for your spouse, you're inviting God to work in both their heart and your own heart. And this aligns you with God's desire for unity in your marriage and opens the way for deeper intimacy and understanding. This is so critical. May the Lord help you in doing this. Amen.